Most of the ocean floor remains unmapped and unseen. Vast mountain ranges, deep valleys, and wide plains stretch across distances bigger than any continent on land, yet we've only glimpsed a fraction of it. Thousands of years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the seas rose dramatically, hundreds of feet in total. Coastlines where people once lived, hunted, and built homes were suddenly swallowed. In some places, the water rose in powerful surges, flooding entire regions and burying the past under layers of sand and sediment. Those ancient shores didn't stay empty forever. Today, sonar scans and daring deep-sea dives are revealing strange formations on the seafloor. Long straight lines where you'd expect only random erosion, sharp angles, and near-perfect symmetry that look almost too orderly, and massive stone blocks arranged in ways that make you wonder, could these be the remains of something built by human hands? These puzzling structures sit in places where, according to what we thought we knew, no advanced societies were supposed to exist at that time. For centuries, the legend of Atlantis has been dismissed as just a story, an ancient tale told by the Greek philosopher Plato about a powerful civilization with impressive buildings, advanced ways of living, and a sudden catastrophic end beneath the waves. Most people have always seen it as a myth or a moral lesson, not a real place, but now parts of the ocean are starting to give up their secrets. In this journey, we'll explore some of the most intriguing underwater discoveries, from submerged stone formations to vast geometric patterns, and hear why a growing number of researchers are quietly asking, could any of this be connected to the lost world Plato once described? The shape of the world was once drawn along edges that no longer exist, where waves now fold endlessly over themselves. There were plains that stretched outward under open sky, wide and exposed, marked by rivers that moved with quiet persistence toward horizons that felt permanent. The boundary between land and sea lay far beyond its present reach, revealing territories that would later vanish without leaving a visible trace. During the last ice age, an immense portion of Earth's water rested in silence, locked within vast continental glaciers that rose like slow, unmoving walls across the northern and southern extremes. These frozen masses held so much volume that the oceans themselves receded, their surfaces lowered by hundreds of feet. In that absence, the seafloor emerged, not as barren emptiness but as living terrain. Valleys, ridges, and coastlines formed intricate environments where wind, fresh water, and sunlight shaped ecosystems that felt no different from those known today. Across these exposed regions, life settled into patterns guided by access and survival. Early human groups moved along the edges where land met water, drawn not by chance but by the reliability those places offered. Shorelines provided fish, shellfish, and migrating animals. Rivers carved pathways inland, creating routes that could be followed and returned to. The ground itself, nourished by sediments and steady moisture, supported vegetation that sustained both humans and the creatures they depended on. These coastal corridors became natural centers of habitation, places where movement slowed and presence deepened. The geography of that time encouraged continuity. What is now separated by water once formed connected expanses, allowing migration across regions that would later be divided by seas. Areas like the broad plains between present-day Europe and Britain, or the submerged shelves of Southeast Asia, were once traversable landscapes. People walked across them, lived within them, and adapted to their rhythms without awareness of how temporary those spaces would prove to be. As temperatures began to rise, the stillness of the ice started to change. Glaciers did not vanish all at once, but their edges softened, retreating slowly in some places, more abruptly in others. Meltwater gathered and flowed, feeding rivers that swelled beyond their usual bounds. Over time, this process accelerated, releasing enormous quantities of water back into the oceans. The seas responded by advancing, inch by inch at first, then in surges that reshaped coastlines with quiet persistence. For those living along these low-lying regions, the transformation would not have appeared as a single moment, but as a gradual shift that became impossible to ignore. Familiar ground would narrow, pathways would disappear, and the distance between settlements and the advancing water would shorten. In some cases, the change may have been subtle, across generations, while in others, sudden events such as meltwater pulses or coastal flooding would have altered the landscape within a human lifetime. The land itself offered no resistance. It yielded as the water returned, covering forests, plains, and the traces of human presence without distinction. Structures, tools, and pathways were left behind, not through abandonment in the usual sense, but through a steady retreat that followed the rising edge of the sea. Over time, entire environments slipped beneath the surface, preserved not in memory alone, but in physical form, beneath layers of sediment and shifting currents. What remains today is not absence but concealment. Beneath the ocean's surface lie the outlines of those earlier worlds, shaped during a time when the balance between ice and water held a very different form. The coastlines that once supported early human life now rest in darkness, their histories carried forward not through visible continuity, but through fragments that endure far below, waiting within a landscape that has not been erased, only submerged. Light moves differently in shallow water, bending and scattering as it passes through the surface, tracing patterns across whatever rests below. In a stretch of sea near the Bahamas, that light settles over something unexpected, revealing shapes that interrupt the natural softness of the ocean floor. Beneath a thin layer of water, a formation extends outward in a line that feels deliberate, its presence quiet but difficult to dismiss. The structure lies just offshore, close enough to be reached without descending into deep or hostile conditions. From above, it appears as a series of large flat stones placed edge to edge, forming a pathway that stretches for hundreds of meters. The blocks vary in size, some spanning several meters across, others smaller but still substantial, their weight measured in tons. Their surfaces are worn, softened by time and tide, yet their arrangement maintains a consistency that draws attention. The line they create is not random nor scattered, but aligned in a way that suggests continuity. As divers move closer, the formation becomes more defined. The stones rest in layers, in some places appearing stacked or slightly offset, creating the impression of steps or terraces. Gaps between the blocks follow patterns that seem measured rather than accidental. Edges meet at angles that repeat across the structure, forming a rhythm that contrasts with the irregular shapes typically produced by erosion or sediment deposition. The ocean around it continues its slow motion, currents passing over and between the stones, leaving them undisturbed in their placement. Geologically, the explanation offered is grounded in processes known to shape coastal environments. Beach rock forms when sand and sediment become cemented over time, binding together under the influence of mineral-rich water. In certain conditions, this material can fracture along lines that create flat surfaces and straight edges. As sections break apart and shift, they may settle into arrangements that appear structured, especially when viewed from a limited perspective. This interpretation frames the formation as a natural outcome shaped by chemistry, pressure, and time. Yet the visual impression resists easy resolution. The scale of the blocks, their alignment, and the apparent intention of their layout continue to invite a different reading. The formation resembles a constructed pathway, its stones placed with purpose, extending in a direction that feels chosen rather than incidental. For some, it suggests the remnants of a boundary, a foundation, or a road leading towards something no longer visible. The idea does not rest on proof, but on the persistent sense that the arrangement carries a pattern beyond coincidence. This tension between explanation and impression has remained since the site was first documented. Measurements have been taken, samples analyzed, and comparisons drawn to similar formations elsewhere. Each layer of study adds detail, yet does not fully dissolve the ambiguity. The stones remain where they are, unchanged in their position, offering no clear indication of origin beyond what can be interpreted from their form. In the broader context of submerged landscapes, the structure holds a particular place. It is accessible, visible, and tangible in a way that many deeper discoveries are not. Its presence allows for direct observation, for careful movement across its surface, for the quiet examination of its edges and contours. This accessibility gives it a weight that extends beyond its physical mass, placing it at the center of ongoing discussion. The formation does not declare itself. It rests beneath shallow water, shaped by forces that may be entirely natural or influenced by hands that left no direct trace. Its lines remain steady, its stones unmoved, holding their position within a landscape that continues to shift around them. At the edge of Japan's southern waters, where the currents shift with steady force along the seabed, a formation rises from the depths with a presence that feels unexpectedly ordered. It does not emerge gradually from scattered rock or broken terrain, but instead presents itself in broad surfaces and defined plains, as though shaped along lines that hold their direction with unusual consistency. The surrounding seafloor carries the softer contours of erosion, yet this structure stands apart, its geometry asserting itself against the flow of the environment. Divers approaching the site encounter a sequence of terraces that descend in measured intervals, each level extending outward before giving way to the next. These surfaces are wide and relatively flat, forming platforms that resemble steps on a scale far larger than any natural incline typically produces. Edges run along these platforms with a clarity that feels distinct, forming boundaries that appear almost straight when traced across their length. In certain sections, vertical faces meet horizontal planes at angles that approach 90 degrees, creating intersections that resemble corners more often associated with constructed spaces than with exposed rock. The formation stretches across a considerable area, its features repeating with variations that maintain a sense of coherence. Channels cut between sections, forming pathways that guide movement through the structure, while isolated pillars and protrusions rise from the main body, suggesting points of division or emphasis within the larger arrangement. The stone itself carries the texture of natural material, weathered by time and shaped by the constant motion of water, yet its larger form resists, blending into the randomness of the surrounding terrain. Geological interpretation centers on the nature of the rock and the forces acting upon it. The formation is composed primarily of sandstone, a material known to fracture along planes of weakness created during its formation. Tectonic activity, combined with pressure and shifting stresses within the Earth's crust, can produce fractures that align in consistent directions. Over extended periods, erosion can accentuate these lines, removing softer material and leaving behind surfaces that appear smooth and defined. Under this view, the terraces and sharp edges are the result of natural processes acting with unusual precision. Even within this explanation, certain features continue to draw attention. The repetition of right angles, the scale of the stepped formations, and the alignment of surfaces create an impression that extends beyond simple fracture patterns. The structure appears organized, its elements arranged in a way that suggests intentional division rather than random breakage. Some observers interpret these characteristics as signs of human influence, proposing that the natural formation may have been modified or shaped further by early inhabitants of the region. The possibility of human involvement introduces a different layer of consideration. If portions of the structure were altered, it would imply a level of interaction with the environment that extends deep into prehistory, far earlier than commonly accepted timelines of construction in that area. This interpretation remains difficult to confirm, as direct evidence, such as tools or clearly shaped artifacts, has not been conclusively identified within the formation. The stone itself offers limited clues, its surfaces shaped equally by geological forces and the slow abrasion of the sea. What remains constant is the visual presence of the site. The formation does not dissolve into ambiguity when observed directly. Its terraces, edges, and angles hold their shape, presenting a configuration that feels deliberate in its structure, regardless of origin. Movement across its surfaces reveals continuity, a sense that each level connects to the next within a broader design that maintains its form across distance. Within the quiet movement of the surrounding water, the structure persists as a fixed point, its geometry set against the fluid environment that encloses it. Whether shaped entirely by natural forces or influenced by human hands, long removed from record, it remains a formation whose precision continues to draw attention, resting beneath the surface with its lines intact and its origin unresolved. Along the western coastline of India, where the Arabian Sea meets the land in a steady rhythm of tide and retreat, traces of an older landscape rest beneath the surface, arranged in patterns that suggest a past shaped by intention rather than chance. The water here does not conceal everything entirely, but it softens outlines and diffuses clarity, leaving behind forms that emerge gradually as divers descend and adjust to the shifting light. Beneath these waters, structures appear in fragments that align across the seabed. Large stone blocks lie in positions that hint at foundations, their placement forming lines that intersect at measured intervals. These alignments create the impression of a grid, an underlying plan that once organized space into defined sections. The stones vary in size, some modest, others more substantial, yet their distribution carries a consistency that suggests they were not scattered by currents alone. Instead, they rest in positions that feel anchored, as though they mark the remains of walls, platforms, or pathways that once stood above the reach of the sea. The sediment that surrounds these formations holds additional details. Objects recovered from the seabed include fragments of pottery, tools shaped from stone, and materials that bear signs of human use. These artifacts do not appear in isolation, but in proximity to the structural remains, linking them to a shared environment that once supported daily activity. Their surfaces carry the marks of time, worn by water and covered in layers that have accumulated over centuries, yet their forms remain recognizable, offering quiet evidence of human presence. The arrangement of the site has drawn comparisons to descriptions preserved in ancient texts, where a city known as Dwarka is described as a place of organized streets, constructed spaces, and deliberate design. These accounts speak of structures built with purpose, arranged in ways that reflect planning and coordination. The patterns observed beneath the water echo aspects of these descriptions, not as exact replicas, but as forms that resonate with the idea of a settlement shaped by human intention. Dating these remains introduces a layer of complexity. Materials recovered from the site have been analyzed using methods that estimate age through the properties of the substances themselves. Some findings suggest that the structures may extend back several thousand years, placing them within a period where early civilizations were already developing systems of organization and construction. This time frame aligns with broader patterns of human settlement, where coastal regions served as centers of activity due to their access to resources and routes of movement. The presence of such a site beneath the sea reflects the broader changes that reshaped coastlines over time. As sea levels rose, areas that once supported habitation were gradually submerged, preserving elements of those environments beneath layers of water and sediment. In this context, the remains off the coast of Dwarka are not isolated anomalies, but part of a larger pattern where human history intersects with shifting geography. What distinguishes this site is the combination of structural alignment and associated artifacts, forming a cohesive picture that extends beyond scattered remains. The grid-like arrangement suggests planning, the artifacts indicate habitation, and the location along a former coastline aligns with known patterns of early settlement. Together, these elements create a scene that feels grounded in both physical evidence and historical narrative. The structures do not present themselves as complete or intact. They exist as remnants, portions of a larger whole that has been altered by time and submerged beneath the sea. Their edges have softened, their surfaces covered, yet their positions remain, holding the outline of a place that once functioned within a living landscape. Within the gentle movement of the water above, the remains of Dwarka persist as a submerged arrangement of stone and artifact, their presence suggesting a level of organization that reflects the capabilities of those who once lived there, preserved quietly beneath the surface where the past continues to rest in place. There was a time when the space between Britain and mainland Europe was not a sea, but a wide and continuous stretch of land that carried life across its surface without interruption. This region, now hidden beneath the North Sea, formed a vast plain known today as Doggerland, a landscape that once supported movement, settlement, and the quiet rhythms of human presence. The terrain extended across what is now open water, shaped by rivers that wound through low valleys and marshes that shifted with seasonal changes. Forests grew in patches across higher ground, while open grasslands provided space for herds of animals to move and graze. The environment was neither harsh nor empty, but varied and resource-rich, offering conditions that allowed human groups to live with a degree of stability. Pathways formed naturally along riverbanks and ridgelines, guiding travel and connecting areas that would later become separated by rising seas. Archaeological evidence of this lost region has not been uncovered through traditional excavation on land, but through fragments brought up from the seafloor. Fishermen working in the North Sea have long retrieved objects entangled in their nets, including shaped flint tools, worked bone, and antler fragments that bear the marks of deliberate use. These items, preserved beneath layers of sediment, point to a human presence that once occupied the area with familiarity and purpose. Each piece offers a small window into activities that unfolded across a landscape now entirely concealed. Advancements in marine surveying have added further detail to this submerged world. Sonar mapping and sediment analysis have revealed the outlines of ancient river systems, channels that still cut through the seabed in patterns that mirror their former courses. These features trace the flow of fresh water across the land before it was overtaken, preserving the structure of a landscape that no longer exists above the surface. In some areas, the remnants of peat beds and forest soils remain intact beneath the sea, holding within them the organic material of plants and trees that once grew in open air. The timeline of Doggerland's disappearance unfolds across thousands of years, shaped by gradual environmental change rather than a single defining event. As temperatures rose following the last ice age, the melting of distant glaciers contributed to a steady increase in sea levels. Water advanced across the low-lying terrain, first altering the edges of the land, then moving inward with a persistence that could not be reversed. Habitable areas became narrower, pathways were interrupted, and regions that once supported life were slowly transformed into shallow waters. In addition to this gradual process, evidence suggests that sudden events may have accelerated the transformation. Underwater landslides along the continental shelf have been linked to large waves that would have moved across the remaining land, reshaping coastlines and contributing to the final stages of submergence. These moments, though brief in duration, would have left lasting impacts on the landscape, further reducing the space available for habitation. What remains of Doggerland today exists entirely beneath the sea, its features preserved in fragments that require careful interpretation. The tools and bones recovered from its former surface carry the imprint of human activity, while the mapped terrain beneath the water outlines a world that once connected regions now divided. Together, these elements form a cohesive record of a place that supported life, movement, and continuity over extended periods of time. Within the broader pattern of submerged landscapes, Doggerland stands as a clear example of how entire inhabited regions can disappear from view. Its transformation from land to seafloor reflects processes that have shaped coastlines across the planet, altering the boundaries of human environments in ways that leave only indirect traces behind. Beneath the surface of the North Sea, the structure of this lost world remains, its presence defined not by what is visible, but by the evidence that continues to emerge from the depths where it now rests. Time does not always move at a single pace across the surface of the earth. There are long stretches where change unfolds slowly, almost unnoticed, and then there are intervals where transformation gathers momentum, compressing centuries into spans that feel far shorter. In the period following the last ice age, the balance between ice and ocean shifted in a way that altered coastlines across the planet, not through a single moment, but through a sequence of changes that carried both gradual persistence and sudden acceleration. As global temperatures rose, the vast ice sheets that had held water in place began to release it back into the ocean. This process did not proceed evenly. Instead, it unfolded in phases, sometimes steady, sometimes punctuated by rapid pulses where large volumes of meltwater entered the seas over relatively short periods. These events, often referred to as meltwater pulses, caused sea levels to rise at rates that would have been noticeable within the span of human lifetimes. Shorelines that had remained stable for generations began to shift inward, altering the relationship between land and water with increasing urgency. Coastal regions, which had long supported human activity, were among the first to experience these changes. Low-lying areas absorbed the advancing sea, their boundaries redrawn as water moved across them in increments that accumulated over time. Rivers adjusted their courses as their mouths widened and deepened, while estuaries expanded into areas that had once been solid ground. The transition was not uniform, and in certain regions, the rise in sea level combined with local geography to produce more abrupt transformations. In addition to the steady encroachment of the ocean, there is evidence of events that introduced sudden disruption into this broader process. The collapse of glacial margins and the release of large bodies of freshwater into the ocean could have generated waves that moved across coastlines with considerable force. Underwater landslides along continental shelves may have displaced vast volumes of water, producing tsunamis that reached inland with little warning. These waves would not have been constant features, but singular occurrences, brief in duration yet capable of reshaping entire stretches of coast. For communities living near the water's edge, these overlapping processes created an environment of continuous adjustment. Settlements that had once been positioned at a distance from the shoreline found themselves closer to the advancing sea. Paths used for movement became submerged or fragmented, requiring new routes to be established. In areas affected by sudden events, the impact would have been more immediate, with land altered in ways that could not be easily adapted to within a single generation. The combined effect of gradual rise and episodic disruption led to the loss of entire inhabited spaces. Some regions would have been abandoned over time as the conditions that supported habitation diminished. Others may have been overtaken more quickly, their structures and materials left behind as water covered them. In both cases, the result was the same. Environments that had once supported human presence were transformed into submerged landscapes. Geological records preserve traces of these changes in layers of sediment and shifts in coastal formations. Variations in grain size, the presence of marine deposits over terrestrial layers, and the abrupt transitions between them reflect periods where the movement of water altered the structure of the land. These markers provide insight into the timing and scale of the events, revealing a pattern of change that was both sustained and, at times, intensified. What emerges from this record is a picture of a world in transition, where the boundary between land and sea was not fixed, but responsive to forces that operated across both long durations and brief intervals. The landscapes that had once extended outward were gradually drawn back, their edges reshaped by the returning ocean. Within this shifting environment, human presence adapted where possible and withdrew where necessary, leaving behind traces that now rest beneath the surface. The processes that guided this transformation did not erase these spaces entirely, but covered them, preserving elements of their structure within the evolving outline of the Earth's coastlines. Far from the slow advance of rising seas, there are moments in Earth's history when change arrives with sudden force, reshaping entire regions within the span of a single event. In the Aegean Sea, the island of Santorini carries the remains of one such moment, preserved in layers of rock and ash that record an eruption of extraordinary scale. Before this event, the island formed part of a larger landmass, its slopes supporting settlements connected to the wider Minoan civilization that flourished across nearby islands and coastal regions. This civilization developed systems of trade, architecture, and daily life that reflected a high degree of organization, with structures built from stone and arranged in ways that balanced function and form. The surrounding sea acted not as a barrier, but as a pathway, linking communities through movement and exchange. Beneath the surface of Santorini, geological forces had been building over extended periods of time. Magma accumulated within chambers below the island, its pressure increasing as gases dissolved within it sought release. This buildup continued quietly, without visible disturbance at the surface, until the internal conditions reached a point where containment was no longer possible. When the eruption began, it did not unfold as a single release, but as a sequence of explosive phases that progressively intensified. The initial activity likely included the emission of ash and volcanic gases, rising into the atmosphere and spreading outward with prevailing winds. As the eruption continued, it entered a phase characterized by the rapid ejection of material, producing columns of ash that extended high above the island. The volume of material released was immense, with pumice and ash falling across the surrounding region, covering landscapes and altering the composition of the ground. At its peak, the eruption generated forces capable of reshaping the island itself. The central portion of the landmass collapsed as the magma chamber beneath it emptied, creating a caldera that now defines the structure of Santorini. This collapse displaced large volumes of water, contributing to the formation of waves that moved outward across the sea. These waves, generated by both the eruption and associated geological shifts, traveled across coastal regions, interacting with shorelines in ways that altered their form. The impact on nearby settlements would have been profound. Ashfall alone could have disrupted agriculture, covered structures, and affected air quality across a wide area. The movement of water, combined with seismic activity, introduced additional layers of disruption, reshaping coastlines and affecting communities that depended on stable conditions for their survival. The cumulative effect of these processes created an environment in which existing systems could not be maintained in their previous form. Archaeological findings on surrounding islands reflect a period of sudden change. Layers of volcanic material overlay earlier structures, preserving them beneath deposits that mark the timing of the eruption. In some locations, evidence suggests that inhabitants left before the most destructive phases occurred, while in others, the material remains capture a moment where activity was interrupted and never resumed. The scale of the Santorini eruption places it among the most significant volcanic events in human history. Its effects extended beyond the immediate vicinity, influencing climate patterns and environmental conditions across a broader region. The dispersal of ash, the alteration of landscapes, and the changes to coastal environments created a ripple of consequences that unfolded over time. Within the context of human history, this event stands as an example of how quickly established systems can be altered by forces originating deep within the earth. The remains of the Minoan civilization continue to be studied through the layers that preserve them, offering insight into a moment where natural processes intersected with human presence in a way that reshaped both the land and the course of activity upon it. The island that remains today carries the imprint of that transformation, its form defined by the absence created during the eruption, and its surrounding waters holding the traces of an event that unfolded with a scale and intensity that continues to be understood through the evidence left behind. Far below the reach of sunlight, where the ocean shifts into a darker and more pressurized state, the seafloor holds features that are known not through direct sight, but through echoes returned by sound. Off the coast of Cuba, in waters that descend far beyond the range of conventional diving, a series of sonar scans has revealed patterns that stand apart from the surrounding terrain, suggesting forms that appear structured rather than dispersed. These images, constructed from reflected acoustic signals, outline shapes that seem to follow geometric order. Lines intersect at angles that resemble planned layouts, forming arrangements that suggest boundaries or divisions within a larger space. Some sections appear to rise from the seafloor in block-like forms, their edges defined by contrasts in density and elevation. The patterns extend across an area that is difficult to measure precisely, as each scan captures only a portion of the terrain, leaving gaps that must be interpreted through successive passes. The depth at which these formations lie introduces significant challenges. At such levels, pressure increases to the point where human presence requires specialized equipment, and even remotely operated vehicles must be designed to withstand conditions that limit their mobility and endurance. Light does not penetrate to these depths, leaving visibility dependent on artificial illumination that can only reveal small sections at a time. Sediment suspended in the water further reduces clarity, softening outlines and obscuring detail. Because of these limitations, the structures identified in sonar data remain distant, translated into visual form through interpretation rather than direct observation. The process of converting sound into image introduces variables that must be carefully considered, as differences in material composition, slope, and surface texture can influence how signals are returned. Patterns that appear precise in one scan may shift in another, depending on angle, resolution, and the movement of the surveying equipment. Geologists examining the data have proposed that the formations could be the result of natural processes shaped by tectonic activity and the gradual settling of the seafloor over time. Fractures within rock layers, combined with shifts in sediment, can produce linear features that intersect in ways that resemble constructed layouts. Over extended periods, these features may become accentuated by erosion and deposition, creating contrasts that appear structured when viewed through sonar imagery. At the same time, the visual coherence of the patterns continues to invite alternative interpretations. The apparent alignment of shapes, the suggestion of repeated angles, and the scale of the formations contribute to an impression that feels organized. Without direct examination, these impressions remain unconfirmed, existing within a space where observation is filtered through layers of technology and interpretation. Efforts to investigate the site more closely have been limited by the depth and complexity of the environment. Deploying equipment capable of capturing detailed imagery at such levels requires careful planning and significant resources, and even then, the area that can be examined during a single expedition remains restricted. As a result, the formations have not been fully mapped or explored in a way that would allow for definitive conclusions. Within the broader context of submerged landscapes, the Cuban site occupies a position defined by its inaccessibility. Unlike shallower locations where structures can be observed directly, this region remains largely beyond reach, its features known only through indirect methods. The information that exists is fragmented, assembled from scans that provide glimpses rather than a complete view. The formations remain where they are, deep beneath the surface, their outlines recorded in data that continues to be studied and debated. Their presence adds to a growing collection of underwater features that resist simple classification, existing in a space where natural processes and the possibility of past human activity intersect without clear resolution. Nothing beneath the ocean remains exposed for long. Even the most solid forms, once left to the movement of water and time, begin to soften at their edges, their outlines gradually absorbed into the shifting layers that settle across the seafloor. What appears at one moment as a clear structure becomes, over years and centuries, something quieter, its presence still there, but increasingly difficult to distinguish from the environment around it. Sediment plays a central role in this slow transformation. Particles carried by rivers, tides, and distant currents drift downward and settle across the ocean floor in a continuous, almost unbroken process. These layers accumulate grain by grain, forming blankets that thicken over time. A structure that once stood exposed can become partially covered, then fully enclosed as each new layer presses gently against the last. The process does not require force, only persistence, and over long durations, it reshapes the surface of the seabed into something smoother, more uniform, less revealing of what lies beneath. Alongside this gradual burial, biological growth contributes to the concealment. Coral colonies attach themselves to hard surfaces, extending outward in complex formations that follow their own patterns of expansion. Over time, these living structures spread across stone and artificial materials alike, coating them in layers that alter both texture and appearance. What may have once been a defined edge becomes irregular, its original form masked beneath organic growth that continues to build upon itself. Other marine organisms, from encrusting algae to shell-forming species, add their own layers, each contributing to a surface that no longer reflects its initial shape. Water movement introduces another dimension to this process. Currents flowing across the seafloor carry not only sediment, but also energy that reshapes the landscape. In some areas, material is deposited, filling gaps and smoothing contours, while in others, it is removed, exposing different layers beneath. This constant exchange prevents the seafloor from remaining static, ensuring that even large features are gradually altered. Edges are worn down, corners softened, and surfaces reshaped in ways that blur distinctions between natural formations and constructed elements. Visibility within the ocean further limits the ability to recognize what remains. Light diminishes with depth, filtering through water in a way that reduces clarity and compresses distance. Even in relatively shallow areas, suspended particles scatter light, creating a haze that obscures detail. As depth increases, darkness becomes more complete, requiring artificial illumination that can only reveal small portions of the surroundings at any given moment. This restricted field of view makes it difficult to perceive large structures in their entirety, reducing them to fragments that must be mentally assembled. Over extended periods, these combined processes transform the seafloor into a layered archive where earlier features are preserved not in their original form, but as impressions beneath successive coverings. A wall becomes a rise beneath sediment. A pathway becomes a subtle variation in texture, and a constructed space becomes indistinguishable from the terrain that surrounds it. The scale of a structure does not protect it from this outcome. Even large formations, given enough time, are reduced to shapes that no longer stand apart. The ocean does not erase with abrupt force, but with continuity. Its methods are steady, almost imperceptible in the short term, yet profound across longer spans. What is hidden beneath its surface is not lost in the sense of being destroyed, but in the sense of being absorbed into a system that reshapes and conceals without pause. Within this environment, the past remains present, though altered, its outlines softened, and its details layered beneath processes that continue without interruption, carrying forward a quiet transformation that leaves little visible trace of what once stood in the open air. Establishing certainty beneath the ocean requires a kind of patience that often meets its limits in the very conditions it seeks to understand. The seafloor does not present evidence in clear sequences, nor does it preserve moments in a way that allows them to be read without interruption. Instead, it holds fragments that have been shifted, altered, and layered in ways that complicate any attempt to assign them a precise place in time. One of the central challenges lies in determining age. On land, dating often relies on materials that retain measurable properties, such as organic remains that can be analyzed through radiocarbon methods. Beneath the ocean, such materials are rarely preserved in stable conditions. Organic matter tends to decay, dissolve, or become dispersed before it can be isolated and studied. Without these elements, researchers must turn to indirect indicators, such as the surrounding sediment or associated materials, each carrying its own uncertainties. Even when datable material is found, its connection to nearby structures is not always straightforward. Objects and surfaces do not remain fixed in their original positions. Currents, biological activity, and geological processes gradually move materials across the seafloor. A fragment discovered beside a formation may have originated from a different location, carried over time by forces that leave little trace of their path. This movement complicates interpretation, as it becomes difficult to determine whether materials and structures share a common origin or have simply come to rest in proximity. The seafloor itself is not a stable archive, but a dynamic environment where layers are constantly being reworked. Sediment can accumulate in one area while being removed from another, exposing deeper layers or burying recent ones. This shifting arrangement disrupts the sequence that dating methods rely upon, creating gaps and overlaps that obscure the true order of events. In such conditions, establishing a clear timeline becomes an exercise in approximation rather than precision. Contamination adds another layer of complexity. Samples collected from underwater sites often carry traces of multiple sources, introduced through contact with surrounding materials or through the process of retrieval. Modern substances can adhere to ancient surfaces, altering the composition of samples in ways that affect analytical results. Even small amounts of contamination can shift measurements, leading to conclusions that require careful adjustment and interpretation. The absence of preserved organic material further limits the range of available methods. Without wood, bone, or plant remains in a condition suitable for analysis, researchers must rely on the properties of inorganic materials, which are often less precise in establishing age. Techniques such as thermoluminescence or uranium series dating can be applied in certain contexts, but each comes with constraints that narrow their applicability. The result is a framework of evidence that must be assembled from multiple partial indicators rather than a single definitive measure. In this environment, interpretation becomes as important as observation. Patterns must be evaluated with an awareness of how easily they can be altered by external forces. A formation that appears consistent may have been reshaped over time, its current form reflecting a combination of original structure and subsequent modification. Distinguishing between these layers requires an approach that balances detail with caution, recognizing the limits imposed by the conditions of preservation. The challenge is not the absence of evidence, but the nature of the evidence itself. What exists beneath the ocean is often sufficient to suggest possibilities, yet rarely complete enough to confirm them without ambiguity. Each discovery adds to a growing body of knowledge, but also introduces new variables that must be accounted for. Within this setting, proof does not emerge as a single clear statement. It forms gradually, through the accumulation of observations that align closely enough to support a shared interpretation, while still leaving space for alternative explanations shaped by the complexities of the underwater world. Patterns emerge even where no intention exists, shaped by forces that follow their own internal rules rather than any guiding design. Along coastlines, across exposed cliffs, and beneath the ocean, stone can break and settle in ways that produce lines, angles, and surfaces that resemble constructed forms. These patterns arise from the behavior of materials under pressure, where the structure of the rock itself determines how it responds to stress over time. In many geological settings, rock develops planes of weakness during its formation. Layers of sediment compress into stone, creating boundaries that differ slightly in composition and strength. When external forces act upon these layers, whether through tectonic movement, shifting weight, or gradual expansion and contraction, the rock tends to fracture along these existing planes. The result can be a network of cracks that intersect at consistent angles, producing shapes that appear ordered and deliberate. Basalt formations offer a clear example of this process. As molten rock cools and contracts, It forms columns that often take on hexagonal or polygonal shapes, their sides meeting at precise angles. These structures extend upward or outward in tightly packed arrangements, creating surfaces that resemble engineered patterns. Sandstone, under different conditions, can fracture into large, flat slabs, their edges aligning in ways that suggest boundaries or pathways. Over time, erosion removes softer material, accentuating these features and leaving behind surfaces that appear smooth and defined. Beneath the ocean, these processes continue, shaped by the additional influence of water movement and chemical interaction. Pressure from overlying layers compresses sediments into rock, while currents and gradual shifts in the seabed introduce forces that encourage fracturing along predictable lines. As these formations are exposed or partially uncovered, their geometry can stand out against the surrounding terrain, drawing attention through its apparent regularity. The human mind responds to these patterns with a tendency to interpret them as intentional. This inclination arises from a natural process of recognition, where familiar shapes and arrangements are identified even in contexts where they may not have been deliberately created. Straight lines, right angles, and repeating forms align with structures commonly associated with human construction, leading to interpretations that connect these natural features to ideas of design and planning. This tendency does not arise from error, but from the way perception organizes information. The brain seeks coherence, assembling visual input into patterns that can be understood quickly and efficiently. In environments where detail is limited or partially obscured, this process becomes more pronounced, filling gaps with familiar forms. Underwater, where visibility is often reduced and perspectives are constrained, the effect can be amplified, making natural formations appear more structured than they might under clearer conditions. Distinguishing between natural and artificial structures requires careful analysis that extends beyond initial impressions. Surface features must be examined in relation to the underlying geology, considering how the material formed and how it has changed over time. Consistency in pattern, repetition of form, and the presence of associated materials all contribute to this evaluation. Yet even with detailed study, the boundary between natural and constructed can remain difficult to define. In some cases, formations that appear highly regular are ultimately explained through known geological processes, their shapes reflecting the inherent properties of the material rather than external design. In others, the possibility of human involvement remains open, supported by patterns that align with known methods of construction. The distinction often lies not in a single feature, but in the accumulation of evidence across multiple observations. Within the broader landscape of submerged and exposed environments, these patterns serve as reminders of the complexity of interpretation. Stone does not require intention to produce forms that resemble architecture, yet those forms can still carry a sense of structure that invites closer attention. As these formations persist across different regions, shaped by processes that operate over extended periods, they occupy a space where natural order and perceived design intersect, leaving their origins to be understood through careful observation rather than immediate assumption. Across distant coastlines, beyond the specific sites already known, traces of submerged landscapes appear in scattered intervals, each one revealing a fragment of a broader pattern that extends across the planet. These locations do not form a single continuous discovery, but rather a quiet accumulation of evidence, emerging from different regions where water now rests over what was once exposed ground. In Southeast Asia, the shallow seas that stretch between present-day islands conceal vast areas of land that existed during periods of lower sea level. Beneath these waters lies a region often referred to as Sundaland, a continuous expanse that once connected mainland Asia to islands that are now separated by open sea. The seafloor in this region preserves the outlines of ancient river systems, channels that once carried fresh water across plains that supported vegetation and animal life. Sediment cores extracted from these submerged areas contain pollen and organic traces that point to environments shaped by forests and wetlands, suggesting conditions that would have supported human presence along their edges. Moving southward, the waters surrounding Australia reveal additional sites where early human activity intersected with landscapes that no longer remain above the surface. Along submerged continental shelves, stone tools and artifacts have been identified in contexts that indicate their original placement occurred when those areas were dry land. These findings extend the known range of early habitation, suggesting that populations occupied regions that are now fully submerged. The distribution of these materials aligns with the idea that coastal zones, now hidden, once formed part of broader networks of movement and settlement. In the Mediterranean, the record takes on a different character, shaped by a long history of interaction between human societies and shifting coastlines. Submerged ruins have been identified near present-day shorelines, where structures built during earlier periods now rest beneath the water due to gradual changes in sea level and local geological activity. Stone blocks, foundations, and fragments of built environments appear in locations that align with known historical settlements. Their positions altered over time as the boundary between land and sea shifted. In some cases, entire sections of ancient harbors and coastal cities lie partially submerged, their outlines preserved beneath layers of marine growth and sediment. These sites, though varied in their specific details, share a common context shaped by the same underlying processes. Changes in sea level, driven by climatic shifts and geological factors, have altered coastlines in ways that extend across continents. The result is a series of submerged environments that reflect different moments in time, each one capturing a stage in the ongoing interaction between land and ocean. The expanding body of evidence from these regions contributes to a broader understanding of how widespread these transformations have been. No single site defines the pattern, but together they form a network of locations that illustrate the scale of change. Each discovery adds detail, whether through mapped terrain, recovered artifacts, or preserved environmental markers, building a picture that extends beyond individual cases. As more areas are surveyed using advanced techniques, additional features continue to emerge, often in places that had not previously been examined in detail. These findings do not always present clear structures or easily interpreted forms, but they contribute to a growing recognition that submerged landscapes are not isolated anomalies. Instead, they represent a consistent outcome of processes that have reshaped the Earth's surface over extended periods. Within this global distribution, the remains of past environments persist beneath layers of water, their presence defined by the traces that can still be detected through careful observation. Each region offers its own perspective, shaped by local conditions and histories, yet all contribute to a shared understanding that the boundaries of human activity have extended into areas now concealed beneath the sea, forming a record that continues to unfold across the world's oceans. Long before written records began to define the boundaries of history, human communities were already shaping their surroundings in ways that reflect planning, coordination, and an understanding of materials that extends beyond simple survival. These capabilities do not appear suddenly in the archaeological record, but emerge gradually, revealed through structures and patterns that indicate deliberate effort applied over extended periods of time. Across different regions, evidence points to the construction of spaces that required more than individual action. Arrangements of stone, aligned with consistency and purpose, suggest the presence of shared plans and collective work. These formations vary in scale, from modest enclosures to larger layouts that organize space into defined areas, yet they share a common feature in their structure. The placement of materials follows patterns that reflect intention, whether in the alignment of edges, the repetition of forms, or the adaptation of natural features into constructed elements. Such work implies coordination among groups, where roles and tasks were distributed in ways that allowed complex projects to be completed. The gathering of materials, the shaping of stone, and the placement of each element required time and continuity, indicating that these communities operated within systems that supported sustained activity. These systems may not have left written records, but their presence is preserved in the physical outcomes that remain. The use of tools further illustrates the level of understanding early humans possessed. Stone implements, shaped with precision, reflect knowledge of how different materials respond to force. The selection of specific types of rock, chosen for their durability or ease of shaping, demonstrates an awareness of properties that influenced construction and daily activity. Over time, these tools became more refined, allowing for greater control in shaping and assembling materials into more complex forms. In some locations, the integration of natural landscapes into constructed spaces reveals an additional layer of capability. Rather than altering the environment entirely, early builders often worked with existing features, incorporating them into their designs. Slopes, rock outcrops, and natural boundaries were used as foundations or supports, reducing the need for extensive modification while still achieving structured layouts. This approach reflects an understanding of the environment that balances efficiency with adaptability. The organization of space within these sites suggests that early societies operated with shared frameworks that guided their activities. Pathways, defined areas, and recurring patterns indicate that movement and use of space were not random, but structured in ways that facilitated interaction and continuity. These patterns imply a level of social organization that supported cooperation, communication, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. Chronological analysis of these structures often places them earlier than previously assumed thresholds for such complexity. As dating techniques improve and new sites are examined, the timeline of human capability extends further into the past, revealing that organized construction and planning were present long before the emergence of written systems. This shift does not redefine human development entirely, but it expands the understanding of how early these abilities were established. The materials used in these constructions also provide insight into technological awareness. The shaping and placement of stone, the use of binding agents where applicable, and the adaptation of available resources reflect an approach that combines practical knowledge with creative application. Each structure becomes a record of decisions made in response to specific conditions, guided by an understanding that evolved through experience. Within this broader perspective, early human capability appears not as a sudden advancement, but as a continuous progression shaped by observation, adaptation, and collaboration. The structures that remain offer a view into this progression, revealing a level of complexity that aligns with the demands of organized living rather than isolated effort. As these sites continue to be studied, they contribute to a growing recognition that early human societies possessed the ability to shape their environments in structured and meaningful ways, leaving behind forms that reflect both their understanding of the world and their capacity to work within it. Beneath the surface of the earth, motion is constant, though it rarely reveals itself in ways that can be seen directly. Plates shift, pressures build, and energy accumulates along boundaries that stretch across oceans and continents. Most of this movement passes without notice, absorbed within the deeper structure of the planet, yet at certain moments it releases suddenly, sending waves of force outward through both land and water. When an earthquake occurs beneath or near the ocean, the displacement of the seafloor can alter the shape of the water above it. Even a vertical shift of a few meters, extending across a large area, is enough to disturb the equilibrium of the ocean, generating waves that move outward from the point of origin. These waves travel with long wavelengths and considerable speed, often unnoticed in open water, where their height remains relatively low. As they approach shallower regions near coastlines, their energy compresses and their height increases, transforming into powerful surges that carry water far inland. The interaction between these waves and coastal environments can lead to rapid and extensive change. Structures positioned along the shoreline are exposed to forces that exceed those encountered in regular tidal cycles. The movement of water is not limited to a single direction, but occurs in sequences, advancing and retreating with momentum that reshapes the terrain. Materials are displaced, surfaces eroded, and the arrangement of the coastline itself can shift within a short period of time. In addition to direct seismic activity, underwater landslides contribute to similar effects. Along continental slopes, accumulations of sediment can become unstable, particularly when disturbed by seismic vibrations or gradual changes in pressure. When these masses of material collapse and move downward, they displace water in a manner that generates waves with characteristics comparable to those produced by earthquakes. These events may occur without surface warning, originating from depths where observation is limited, yet their impact can extend across large distances. Coastal collapse represents another dimension of this process, where the boundary between land and sea is altered by the combined effects of geological movement and water interaction. Cliffs and coastal shelves, weakened over time by erosion or structural instability, can give way suddenly, contributing additional material to the ocean and altering the shape of the shoreline. This collapse can amplify the effects of incoming waves, creating conditions where multiple processes converge to reshape the environment in a single sequence of events. For communities situated along these coastlines, such changes would have introduced a layer of unpredictability that contrasts with the slower processes of environmental transformation. Settlements established near the water for access to resources and movement would have faced conditions where stability could not be assumed indefinitely. The evidence of these events is preserved not in continuous records, but in disrupted layers of sediment, displaced materials, and the altered arrangement of coastal features. Geological studies of these regions reveal patterns that correspond to sudden disturbances, including deposits that differ from surrounding layers in composition and structure. These deposits may contain a mixture of marine and terrestrial materials, indicating that water and land were brought together in ways that differ from gradual processes. The presence of such layers provides insight into moments where the usual order of the environment was interrupted by forces originating beneath the surface. Within the broader context of changing coastlines, earthquakes, underwater landslides, and coastal collapse act as mechanisms that accelerate transformation. They do not replace the slower processes of sea level rise and sediment accumulation, but intersect with them, introducing intervals where change occurs rapidly. The landscapes shaped by these events carry the imprint of both gradual and sudden forces, their current form reflecting a history where stability and disruption coexist, each contributing to the evolving boundary between land and sea. Long after physical structures have been altered or submerged, traces of past events can continue in a different form, carried not by stone or sediment, but through memory shaped into narrative. In many cultures, accounts of distant events were preserved through oral traditions, passed from one generation to the next in patterns of repetition that allowed details to endure even as the environments that inspired them changed. These traditions did not function as fixed records, but as living expressions that adapted over time. Stories were shared in gatherings, recited with care, and shaped by those who carried them forward. While the precise wording could shift, certain elements remained consistent, especially those tied to significant experiences. Events that altered landscapes, disrupted communities, or reshaped the relationship between people and their surroundings often became embedded within these narratives, their memory preserved through symbolic language and recurring themes. Across different regions, accounts of rising water and submerged lands appear with notable frequency. These stories describe changes that extend beyond ordinary seasonal variation, presenting scenes where familiar ground becomes covered, where movement is interrupted, and where communities are forced to adapt to altered conditions. The details vary, shaped by local geography and cultural context, yet the underlying structure often reflects a transition from stability to transformation, carried through imagery that conveys both scale and permanence. In some traditions, these events are framed through the actions of deities or forces beyond human control, providing a framework that connects environmental change to broader systems of meaning. The use of symbolic interpretation allows complex experiences to be expressed in ways that are accessible and memorable, ensuring that the narrative can be retained even as the original context becomes more distant. This blending of observation and interpretation does not diminish the connection to real events, but reshapes it into a form that can endure through time. The persistence of these stories suggests that they may contain elements rooted in actual experiences, preserved in a manner that prioritizes continuity over exact detail. As generations pass, the original events may become less distinct, yet the core themes remain, reflecting the significance of what was observed. The repetition of similar motifs across cultures, particularly those involving water, transformation, and loss of land, points to shared patterns that may have emerged from comparable environmental changes. The absence of physical evidence in some cases does not negate the presence of these narratives. Instead, it highlights the different ways in which information can be preserved. While structures may be altered by natural processes, stories can persist through adaptation, maintaining a connection to past events, even as their form evolves. This continuity allows for the transmission of knowledge that might otherwise be lost, carried forward through language, ritual, and collective memory. In examining these traditions, it becomes possible to identify points of convergence between narrative and environmental history. Descriptions of changing coastlines, displaced communities, and altered landscapes can be compared with geological and archaeological findings, revealing parallels that extend across different forms of evidence. These connections do not provide direct confirmation, but they offer a framework for understanding how human experience and natural processes intersect in ways that are preserved through multiple channels. The blending of history and storytelling creates a layered record where factual elements are interwoven with symbolic interpretation. This combination allows stories to function both as reflections of past events and as expressions of cultural identity, carrying meaning that extends beyond their original context. Within this interplay, the memory of places that no longer exist above the surface continues to persist, not through visible structures, but through narratives that retain the imprint of those environments, shaped into forms that endure across generations, even as the physical world continues to change. In the long process of understanding the past, not every idea is carried forward with equal weight. Some remain at the edges of inquiry, shaped more by uncertainty than by confirmation, and it is within this space that the concept of Atlantis has largely remained. Its presence in discussion has been persistent, yet its acceptance within scientific frameworks has been limited, guided by the standards that define how evidence is evaluated and interpreted. The primary challenge lies in the absence of direct, verifiable evidence. Archaeology and geology rely on physical materials that can be examined, dated, and placed within a consistent context. Structures, tools, and organic remains provide the foundation for reconstructing past environments and human activity. In the case of Atlantis, no site has been identified that satisfies these criteria in a way that allows for clear and consistent interpretation. Without such evidence, the concept cannot be anchored to a specific location or time frame, leaving it outside the range of conclusions that can be drawn with confidence. This absence has been compounded by the way Atlantis has been presented over time. The account originates from philosophical texts, where it serves a role that extends beyond historical description. The narrative includes elements that align with storytelling, including themes of power, structure, and sudden transformation. As the story was shared and reinterpreted across generations, additional layers were added, often shaped by cultural interests rather than empirical investigation. This association with speculative interpretation has influenced how the concept is perceived, placing it within a category that is approached with caution. Scientific inquiry operates through methods that prioritize repeatability and consistency. Observations must be supported by data that can be tested and verified, allowing findings to be evaluated independently. When a claim is made, it must be supported by evidence that aligns with established understanding or provides a clear basis for revision. In the absence of such support, the claim remains unconfirmed, not dismissed outright, but held at a distance until further information becomes available. The concept of Atlantis has often been linked to interpretations that extend beyond the available evidence. Proposed locations have varied widely, spanning different regions and depths, each suggestion based on partial observations or theoretical connections. These variations introduce inconsistencies that make it difficult to form a unified framework. Without convergence toward a single, well-supported interpretation, the idea remains fragmented, its elements dispersed across multiple possibilities rather than consolidated into a coherent model. Scientific caution also reflects the recognition that natural processes can produce features that resemble those attributed to lost civilizations. Geological formations, underwater structures, and patterns within the seafloor can create impressions that appear organized or intentional. Distinguishing between natural and artificial origins requires detailed analysis, and without clear indicators, interpretations must remain tentative. This cautious approach prevents conclusions from being drawn prematurely, ensuring that interpretations remain aligned with the available data. At the same time, the absence of confirmation does not equate to final resolution. The ocean continues to conceal vast areas that have yet to be explored in detail, and new discoveries have expanded the understanding of submerged landscapes. These findings demonstrate that human history extends into regions now beneath the sea, though they do not directly confirm the existence of a single, unified civilization matching the description of Atlantis. Within this context, the concept persists as a point of inquiry shaped by both evidence and interpretation. It exists alongside established findings, not as a confirmed element, but as an idea that remains open to evaluation under the conditions that govern scientific study. The careful distance maintained by scientific disciplines reflects a commitment to methods that prioritize clarity and consistency, ensuring that conclusions are supported by evidence that can be examined and understood within a structured framework, even when the subject itself continues to invite attention. Clarity in the search for submerged history does not come from a single discovery, but from the convergence of multiple lines of evidence that align with one another. In underwater environments, where visibility is limited and preservation is uneven, scientists rely on patterns that extend beyond isolated features, seeking indicators that suggest organization, activity, and continuity rather than coincidence. One of the most important elements is the presence of structured layouts. These are not simply arrangements that appear ordered at first glance, but configurations that maintain consistency across scale and orientation. A series of aligned features, intersecting at repeatable angles, can suggest planning when those patterns persist beyond a single viewpoint. Researchers examine how these layouts relate to the surrounding terrain, whether they follow natural contours or impose a distinct geometry that stands apart from geological processes. The goal is not to identify perfection, but to recognize coherence that reflects deliberate placement. Alongside structural patterns, the discovery of tools and artifacts provides a more direct connection to human activity. Objects shaped through controlled processes, such as flaked stone or carved materials, carry signatures that distinguish them from naturally occurring forms. These items reveal methods of production, use, and adaptation, offering insight into how materials were selected and modified. When artifacts are found in association with structural features, their significance increases, linking physical arrangements to the presence of human interaction within that environment. The challenge of dating remains central to this process. Without a reliable timeline, even well-defined structures and artifacts cannot be fully understood within their historical context. Scientists look for materials that can be analyzed using established methods, including organic remains preserved in stable conditions or mineral formations that record changes over time. These datable elements provide anchor points, allowing the surrounding evidence to be placed within a broader chronological framework. The reliability of these measurements depends on careful sampling and the avoidance of contamination, ensuring that the results reflect the original conditions as closely as possible. Consistency across sites adds another layer of validation. A single location may present features that suggest human involvement, yet without comparable findings elsewhere, interpretation remains limited. When similar patterns, materials, and structural characteristics appear in multiple regions, they begin to form a network of evidence that supports a shared understanding. This consistency does not require identical structures, but rather recurring principles that indicate similar processes or capabilities. The repetition of such features across different environments strengthens the case for deliberate construction rather than isolated natural formation. Technological tools play a significant role in identifying these elements. Sonar mapping, remote sensing, and submersible exploration allow researchers to examine areas that would otherwise remain inaccessible. These methods provide data that can be analyzed for patterns, guiding further investigation and helping to distinguish between random variation and meaningful arrangement. The integration of these technologies with traditional archaeological approaches creates a more comprehensive framework for interpreting underwater sites. Within this framework, interpretation remains cautious, guided by the need to balance observation with verification. Each piece of evidence is considered in relation to others, forming a system where conclusions emerge from alignment rather than assumption. The presence of structured layouts, artifacts, datable materials, and consistency across sites does not guarantee a single outcome, but it establishes the conditions under which interpretations can move from possibility toward probability. The process unfolds gradually, with each discovery contributing to a larger picture that remains incomplete but increasingly defined. Beneath the surface, where environments continue to shift and conceal, scientists focus on these markers as points of reference, allowing them to navigate a landscape where clarity must be constructed from fragments that align closely enough to reveal a pattern of human presence within the broader history of the Earth. Sound becomes a form of sight, where light can no longer reach, extending perception into depths that remain otherwise inaccessible. Across vast stretches of the ocean, pulses of acoustic energy travel downward, reflect off the seafloor, and return with subtle variations that can be translated into detailed maps. This process, known as sonar mapping, has transformed the way submerged landscapes are observed, allowing features to emerge from darkness as patterns of elevation, texture, and structure. These maps do not reveal the seafloor in a single glance, but assemble it gradually, line by line, as vessels move across the surface. Each pass contributes a narrow band of data, which is then combined with others to form a broader image. Over time, this accumulation creates a representation of terrain that includes ridges, depressions, and formations that might otherwise remain hidden. In certain areas, these patterns take on shapes that suggest alignment or repetition, drawing attention to regions that warrant closer examination. To move beyond these initial observations, underwater drones, often referred to as remotely operated vehicles, are deployed into the depths. These machines carry cameras, sensors, and sampling tools, navigating through environments that are beyond direct human reach. Guided from the surface, they descend along controlled paths, their lights illuminating sections of the seafloor in narrow beams that reveal texture and detail. Through these systems, it becomes possible to observe surfaces directly, capturing images that complement the broader patterns identified through sonar. The movement of these vehicles is deliberate and measured, constrained by the conditions of pressure, visibility, and terrain. Each descent is planned to maximize coverage while preserving the integrity of the equipment, and each observation is recorded for later analysis. The footage they gather provides a closer view of formations, allowing edges, surfaces, and materials to be examined in ways that sonar alone cannot achieve. Together, these approaches create a layered understanding where broad mapping and detailed inspection inform one another. Above the ocean, satellite imaging adds another dimension to this process. While satellites cannot penetrate deep water directly, they can detect variations in the surface that correspond to features below. Changes in sea surface height, influenced by the gravitational pull of underwater structures, can be measured with precision, offering indirect clues about the shape of the seafloor. These measurements are combined with other data to refine maps, extending coverage into areas that have not yet been surveyed in detail. As these technologies continue to develop, the rate of discovery has increased. Regions that were once represented as empty or uniform are now revealed to contain complex terrain marked by features that reflect both natural processes and in some cases, patterns that invite further investigation. Each new dataset contributes to a growing archive, expanding the known contours of the ocean floor and highlighting areas where additional exploration may yield significant findings. The integration of these tools has created a system where observation is no longer limited by depth alone. Instead, the seafloor can be approached through multiple layers of analysis, each providing a different perspective on the same environment. Sonar outlines the broad structure, drones reveal surface detail, and satellite data offers contextual information that links these observations into a coherent whole. Within this expanding framework, the ocean becomes less opaque, its hidden landscapes gradually brought into view through methods that extend human perception into spaces that were once beyond reach. The discoveries that emerge from this process do not arrive all at once, but accumulate steadily, each one adding to a more complete understanding of what lies beneath. Shaped by technologies that continue to refine the ability to observe, record, and interpret the seafloor in ever greater detail. Beyond the mapped contours and surveyed corridors, the ocean descends into regions where knowledge thins and detail gives way to broad outlines. At the edges of continental shelves, the seafloor drops away from relatively shallow expanses into steeper slopes that lead toward deeper basins. These boundaries mark transitions between environments that differ not only in depth, but in the conditions that shape what can be observed and recorded. The continental shelf itself extends outward from land, forming a submerged platform that, in many areas, has been studied with increasing resolution. Yet at its outer margins, where the seabed begins to fall more sharply, mapping becomes less complete. The gradients steepen, the terrain becomes more irregular, and the methods used to survey these areas encounter limitations in both coverage and precision. These edges form zones where the known gradually gives way to the partially understood, where each new survey fills gaps that still extend beyond the reach of current data. Descending further, the ocean floor opens into deep basins that span vast distances. These regions, lying several kilometers below the surface, are shaped by geological processes that operate over immense timescales. Sediment settles slowly across these plains, forming layers that can preserve records of environmental change, while underlying structures reflect movements within the Earth's crust. Despite their scale, these basins remain among the least explored environments on the planet, their extent mapped in broad terms but lacking the detailed resolution available in shallower areas. The difficulty of exploration in these depths arises from multiple factors that act together. Pressure increases steadily with depth, requiring equipment capable of withstanding forces that exceed those encountered near the surface. Temperature drops, creating conditions that affect both mechanical systems and the behavior of materials. Light is absent, leaving visibility entirely dependent on artificial sources that illuminate only limited areas at any given moment. Communication between surface and depth is constrained, introducing delays and complexities that influence how exploration is conducted. Within these constraints, the coverage achieved by existing surveys remains uneven. Certain regions have been mapped with relative detail, often where specific research efforts have been concentrated, while others are represented only by coarse measurements that outline general features without revealing finer structure. The result is a patchwork of information, where areas of clarity are surrounded by expanses that remain largely unexamined. In addition to the deep basins, there are trenches and depressions that extend even further, forming some of the most inaccessible environments on Earth. These features, carved by tectonic activity, descend to depths that challenge the limits of current technology. Exploration in these areas has been achieved only in isolated instances, each expedition providing valuable data but covering a very small portion of the overall landscape. The concept of unexplored regions does not imply a complete absence of knowledge, but rather an understanding that existing data represents only a fraction of what is present. Maps provide outlines, measurements, offer estimates, yet the detailed structure of these environments remains largely unknown. Each new mission contributes additional information, gradually refining the picture, but the scale of the ocean ensures that much remains beyond immediate reach. Within this vast and largely unobserved domain, the seafloor continues to hold features shaped by both natural processes and the history of changing coastlines. The limits of exploration define what can currently be seen, while the areas beyond those limits retain their form without direct observation. As technology advances and methods improve, these regions may become more accessible, yet for now, they exist as spaces where the boundary between known and unknown remains clearly defined, extending across depths where the ocean continues without interruption, holding its remaining details beneath layers of distance and pressure. Depth does not remain fixed across geological time, and the position of any landscape is shaped by forces that extend far beyond its original formation. What rests deep beneath the ocean today may not have begun at such depths, but arrived there gradually, carried downward through processes that alter the elevation of entire regions over long durations. The movement of the Earth's crust operates on scales that are difficult to perceive directly. Tectonic plates shift, collide, and separate, creating patterns of uplift and subsidence that reshape the surface in subtle yet persistent ways. Along certain margins, sections of the crust descend slowly, their elevation decreasing relative to the surrounding environment. When this downward movement occurs in areas that were once near or above sea level, the result is a gradual transition from land to submerged terrain, extending far beyond the effects of rising water alone. Over extended periods, this subsidence can carry structures and landscapes to depths that place them well outside the range of typical exploration. A settlement that once existed along a stable coastline may find its remains transported downward, layer by layer, as the underlying crust shifts. The process does not disrupt the entire structure at once, but alters its position relative to sea level, leaving portions of the original environment preserved beneath increasing depth. In regions where tectonic activity is more pronounced, these changes can be accompanied by additional transformations. Fault lines introduce zones where the crust fractures and moves, sometimes displacing sections of land vertically. A single event may shift a region by several meters, while repeated activity over time can produce more substantial changes. These movements, combined with sediment accumulation and erosion, contribute to a landscape that evolves continuously, its earlier forms repositioned and reshaped. The possibility that older structures now rest at greater depths emerges from this interplay between geological movement and environmental change. As coastlines have shifted and land has subsided, the locations that once supported human activity have not only been submerged, but in some cases carried further downward by the gradual motion of the crust. This process extends the range of potential sites beyond the relatively shallow areas that have been more extensively studied. Evidence for such movement can be found in the broader patterns of geological formation. Layers of sediment reveal sequences where environments transition from terrestrial to marine conditions, indicating that land once existed where water now prevails. In certain cases, these layers are found at depths that suggest additional downward displacement beyond what would be expected from sea level rise alone. This indicates that tectonic processes have played a role in shaping the current position of these environments. Exploration at these greater depths remains limited, constrained by the same factors that define the boundaries of current technology. As depth increases, the ability to observe, map, and sample becomes more challenging, reducing the amount of detailed information that can be gathered. This limitation means that potential sites located within these deeper regions may remain undetected, their presence inferred only through indirect evidence. The concept of deeper ruins does not rely on a single discovery, but on the understanding that the Earth's surface is not static. Landscapes shift, descend, and are redefined over time, carrying with them the traces of what once existed upon them. These traces may persist in altered forms, embedded within layers that reflect both their original context and the processes that have acted upon them since. Within this framework, the ocean's depths become more than a boundary of exploration. They represent a continuation of environments that have moved beyond their initial position. The remains of earlier landscapes may lie within these regions, not as isolated anomalies, but as elements of a broader pattern shaped by the ongoing motion of the planet itself, extending the reach of submerged history into areas that remain largely beyond direct observation. In certain regions of the ocean, the conditions that make exploration difficult also create environments where preservation occurs with unusual effectiveness. Far below the surface, where circulation is limited and the exchange of materials is reduced, the processes that typically break down organic and structural remains begin to slow. What might degrade rapidly in more active environments can persist for extended periods under these constraints, held in place by factors that limit both biological and chemical activity. One of the most significant influences is the availability of oxygen. In areas where water movement is restricted, oxygen levels can become depleted, creating conditions that are less favorable for organisms responsible for decomposition. Bacteria that rely on oxygen to break down organic material operate at reduced rates or are absent altogether, allowing remains to persist longer than they would in more oxygen-rich settings. This reduction in biological activity does not halt decay entirely, but it alters its pace, extending the time frame over which materials can remain intact. Temperature further contributes to this effect. At greater depths, the ocean maintains consistently low temperatures, often just above freezing. These conditions slow chemical reactions, including those involved in the breakdown of organic compounds. Materials that would otherwise deteriorate more quickly in warmer environments experience a kind of suspension, where change continues but at a significantly reduced rate. The combination of low temperature and limited oxygen creates a setting where preservation becomes more likely, particularly for structures and materials that are already stable in form. Pressure, while often considered a challenge for exploration, also plays a role in maintaining these environments. The immense weight of the overlying water column compresses sediments and stabilizes the seafloor, reducing the likelihood of disturbance. In areas where currents are weak, this stability allows layers to remain relatively undisturbed, preserving the arrangement of materials as they settle. Objects that become embedded within these layers can remain in place, protected from the forces that might otherwise shift or erode them. Sediment itself contributes to preservation by forming a protective barrier around buried materials. As particles accumulate, they create a covering that isolates underlying layers from direct interaction with the surrounding water. This isolation limits exposure to oxygen and reduces the impact of biological activity, creating conditions where organic remains can persist. In some cases, entire sections of the seafloor act as archives, holding within them sequences of material that reflect different periods of deposition. The interplay between these factors creates environments where traces of past activity can endure in ways that differ from those on land or in shallower waters. Structures may retain their form, surfaces may remain defined, and materials may persist in recognizable states despite the passage of time. This preservation does not guarantee completeness, as some elements will still degrade or be altered, but it increases the likelihood that significant features remain identifiable. These conditions are not uniform across all underwater environments. They occur in specific contexts where circulation, temperature, and sedimentation align to produce a stable setting. Identifying such areas requires an understanding of oceanographic patterns and the distribution of environmental factors that influence preservation. Once located, these regions offer opportunities to examine materials that have been protected from the more active processes found elsewhere. Within these preserved spaces, the past is held in a form that reflects both its original state and the conditions that have acted upon it since. The balance between decay and preservation is shaped by the environment, determining which elements endure and which are lost. As exploration continues, these areas provide valuable insights into how materials can persist beneath the ocean, offering a view into submerged environments where time moves differently, guided by factors that slow the processes of change and allow traces of earlier landscapes to remain. Absence is not always the result of something never being there, but often the result of not yet having looked in the right way, or in the right place, or with the right expectations guiding the search. Across the ocean floor, the limits of exploration have shaped what is known, leaving vast regions only partially observed, their details inferred rather than directly seen. A significant portion of the seafloor remains mapped at low resolution, its contours outlined but not examined with the level of detail required to identify smaller or more subtle features. Survey efforts have historically focused on areas of immediate relevance, such as shipping routes, resource exploration, or regions near coastlines. This focus has created a pattern where certain zones are studied extensively, while others remain largely unexamined. Within these less explored regions, structures or patterns that do not stand out at broader scales may pass unnoticed, their presence concealed within data that lacks sufficient clarity. The methods used to interpret what is observed also influence what is recognized. Expectations guide attention, shaping how patterns are identified and classified. When a formation aligns with known geological processes, it is often categorized accordingly, especially in the absence of additional evidence suggesting alternative origins. This approach reflects a reliance on established frameworks, which provide consistency but can also limit the consideration of less conventional possibilities. Features that fall outside expected categories may be interpreted within those categories, not because they fully align, but because the framework does not readily accommodate alternatives. Assumptions about the capabilities of early human societies have also played a role in shaping interpretation. If construction at a certain scale or complexity is not expected within a given time frame, features that suggest such activity may be attributed to natural processes by default. This does not arise from oversight, but from the need to align conclusions with existing knowledge. As new evidence extends the timeline of human capability, earlier interpretations may be reconsidered, revealing that some features previously classified as natural may warrant further examination. The nature of underwater environments further contributes to the possibility of overlooked evidence. Visibility is often limited, perspectives are constrained, and the ability to observe large areas simultaneously is restricted. A structure may be partially visible, its form interrupted by sediment, biological growth, or uneven terrain. Without a complete view, its overall pattern may not be immediately apparent, reducing the likelihood that it will be recognized as part of a larger arrangement. Data interpretation introduces another layer where subtle details can be missed. Sonar images, for example, require careful analysis to distinguish meaningful patterns from variations in terrain. The resolution of the data, the angle of observation, and the processing techniques used can all influence how features appear. A pattern that is clear under one set of conditions may be less distinct under another, leading to differences in interpretation that depend on the context in which the data is examined. The accumulation of these factors creates conditions where evidence can exist without being fully recognized. It may be present within datasets that have not been revisited or within regions that have not yet been examined in detail. It may appear in forms that do not immediately align with expectations, requiring a shift in perspective to be understood. Within this framework, the idea of having missed something does not imply a lack of effort, but reflects the complexity of the environment and the evolving nature of the tools and assumptions used to study it. As exploration expands and methods improve, previously overlooked details may become clearer, emerging from the background of data where they had remained indistinct. The ocean continues to hold its features within layers of distance, interpretation, and expectation, shaping what is seen and what remains unnoticed, not through concealment alone, but through the limits of how observation is guided and understood over time. No single site aligns completely with the image that has been carried through time, yet several locations echo fragments of it, each offering a partial resemblance that feels close but never fully resolved. Across different regions, formations, ruins, and submerged landscapes present characteristics that seem to correspond with elements of a larger description, though each remains incomplete in its alignment. Some sites present structural features that suggest organization with patterns that resemble streets, platforms, or boundaries. These arrangements carry a sense of design, their elements positioned in ways that extend beyond random distribution. Yet in many cases, the scale does not match expectations, or the surrounding evidence does not support the presence of a broader settlement. The structure exists, but its context remains uncertain, leaving it as a fragment rather than a complete system. Other locations offer artifacts and materials that indicate human activity, recovered from environments now beneath the sea. Tools, fragments of constructed surfaces, and traces of habitation suggest that people once occupied these areas, interacting with the landscape in deliberate ways. However, the layout of these sites may lack the complexity or coherence associated with larger urban structures, presenting evidence of presence without the full framework of a developed city. There are also formations that appear strikingly geometric, their shapes defined by lines and angles that resemble constructed architecture. These features often draw attention due to their visual clarity, standing out against surrounding terrain. Yet, geological analysis frequently provides explanations rooted in natural processes where fracturing patterns and erosion create forms that mimic intentional design. In these cases, the resemblance is strong, but the origin remains aligned with processes that do not involve human construction. In some regions, the depth at which features are found introduces additional uncertainty. Structures located far below the surface suggest the possibility of significant changes in sea level or geological displacement, yet the evidence required to confirm their origin is often limited by accessibility. Without direct observation and detailed sampling, interpretations rely on indirect data, leaving conclusions open to revision as new information becomes available. Chronology presents another layer where alignment becomes partial. Certain sites can be dated to periods that correspond with known phases of early human development, while others extend beyond established timelines, raising questions about the feasibility of construction at such times. These differences create inconsistencies that prevent a unified interpretation, as each site must be understood within its own temporal context. Geographic distribution further complicates the picture. The sites that share similarities are scattered across distant regions, separated by vast expanses of ocean and differing environmental histories. While this distribution reflects the global nature of changing coastlines, it also introduces variation in conditions that influence how each site developed and was preserved. The result is a collection of locations that share certain features, yet differ in ways that prevent them from forming a single cohesive narrative. The accumulation of these cases creates a pattern of near alignment, where multiple sites reflect aspects of a broader idea without fully embodying it. Each contributes a piece, whether through structure, artifact, or form, yet none integrates all elements into a complete representation. The similarities draw attention, suggesting connections that extend across regions, while the differences maintain a level of separation that resists consolidation. Within this landscape of partial matches, the search continues through comparison and analysis, where each site is evaluated in relation to others, forming a network of evidence that is connected yet distinct. The presence of these near alignments does not resolve the question, but it shapes the way it is approached, guiding attention toward patterns that emerge across locations while acknowledging the gaps that remain between them. Proof, in this context, is not a single moment of recognition, but a gradual alignment of details that reinforce one another until uncertainty narrows into clarity. Within underwater environments, where visibility is limited and preservation varies, the threshold for such clarity is defined by the convergence of multiple forms of evidence, each supporting the others in a consistent and verifiable way. Clear structures would form one of the most direct indicators. These are not simply shapes that appear organized, but configurations that maintain their pattern across scale, orientation, and perspective. Walls that intersect at repeatable angles, pathways that extend with continuity, and layouts that suggest division of space into functional areas all contribute to this clarity. The defining characteristic is coherence, where the arrangement cannot be explained solely through natural processes, and where its form remains consistent when observed from different viewpoints and under varying conditions. Equally important is the presence of datable artifacts, materials that can be analyzed to establish a reliable time frame. Objects shaped through human activity, such as tools, ceramics, or worked materials, carry signatures that distinguish them from natural formations. When these artifacts are found within or directly associated with structural features, they provide a connection between the physical layout and the human actions that produced it. The ability to date these materials with precision anchors the site within a specific period, allowing it to be placed within the broader timeline of human development. The relationship between structures and artifacts must also be consistent. It is not enough for these elements to exist independently within the same general area. Their association must reflect a shared context. artifacts should be located in positions that correspond with the use of the structures, such as within enclosed spaces, along defined pathways, or in areas that suggest activity. This spatial relationship strengthens the interpretation, linking form and function in a way that supports a coherent understanding of the site. Consistency across multiple lines of evidence further reinforces the validity of a finding. Geological analysis should align with the interpretation of the structures, confirming that the materials and formations are compatible with construction rather than natural fracturing. Environmental data should support the presence of a habitable landscape at the time indicated by the artifacts, reflecting conditions that would have allowed human activity. When these independent strands of information converge, they create a framework where each element supports the others. Replication of similar patterns across different sites adds another dimension to what would be considered proof. If comparable structures, artifacts, and contextual relationships are identified in multiple locations, the likelihood of coincidental formation decreases. Instead, these recurring features suggest shared processes or capabilities, extending the interpretation beyond a single isolated case. The consistency of these patterns across regions strengthens the overall conclusion, indicating that the observed features are part of a broader phenomenon. The methods used to gather and analyze this evidence must also meet standards of reliability and transparency. Observations should be reproducible, allowing independent verification through repeated surveys or alternative techniques. Data must be documented in a way that enables comparison and scrutiny, ensuring that interpretations are based on information that can be examined from multiple perspectives. This process of verification is essential in establishing confidence, transforming observations into conclusions that can be accepted within a scientific framework. Within this system, proof emerges not as a sudden revelation, but as a stable structure built from aligned evidence. Each element contributes to a larger picture, where clarity arises from the agreement between independent observations and analyses. The result is an understanding that is grounded in consistency, where the presence of clear structures, datable artifacts, and supporting evidence forms a cohesive whole that withstands careful examination. Scale is often difficult to perceive when it unfolds gradually, when change moves in increments that feel small in isolation, yet accumulate into transformations that span entire regions. Along ancient shorelines, this accumulation reshaped not only the edges of continents, but the extent of environments that once supported interconnected systems of life and human activity. Coastlines that now define the boundary between land and sea were once positioned far beyond their present reach. The areas that lay between those former boundaries and the modern shoreline were not empty spaces, but environments shaped by rivers, vegetation, and the movement of animals. These regions formed continuous corridors where ecosystems developed in relation to both land and water, creating zones of interaction that supported a wide range of life. Within these environments, patterns of habitation emerged that reflected the availability of resources and the stability of the landscape. Human communities established themselves in places where water, food, and movement converged, forming networks that extended across these now submerged areas. These networks were not isolated, but connected through pathways that followed natural features, allowing exchange, adaptation, and continuity over time. As the balance between ice and ocean shifted, these coastlines moved inward, gradually covering the environments that had developed along their edges. The transition did not occur uniformly, and its effects varied across regions, yet the cumulative result was the same. Areas that once supported entire ecosystems were transformed into marine environments, their original characteristics replaced by conditions shaped by saltwater, pressure, and reduced light. The ecosystems that existed within these submerged regions were complex, consisting of plant life adapted to coastal conditions, animal populations that depended on both terrestrial and aquatic resources, and the interactions between them. When these environments were covered, their structures did not simply disappear, but were altered in ways that changed how they functioned. Some elements persisted in modified forms, while others were lost entirely, leaving behind traces that are now preserved within sediment and geological records. Human cultures that developed within these landscapes were shaped by their surroundings, reflecting the rhythms and resources of the environments in which they existed. The loss of these regions did not occur as a single event, but through a sequence of changes that required adaptation and movement. Communities relocated, pathways shifted, and the continuity of certain practices was disrupted as the landscapes that supported them were transformed. The scale of this transformation extends beyond individual sites or isolated discoveries. It encompasses entire regions where land, ecosystems, and human activity once coexisted, forming integrated systems that functioned over extended periods. The submergence of these regions represents not only a change in geography, but a reconfiguration of the relationships that existed within them. Evidence of this scale is reflected in the distribution of submerged features across different parts of the world. Patterns of ancient river systems, preserved beneath the seafloor, indicate the presence of extensive drainage networks that once shaped the landscape. Sediment layers contain traces of vegetation and organic material, pointing to environments that supported diverse forms of life. Artifacts recovered from these areas suggest human interaction with these landscapes, providing a link between environmental and cultural history. The cumulative effect of these changes is a reduction in the visible record of past environments, as large portions of what once existed above the surface now lie beneath the ocean. The boundaries of what is currently observed represent only a portion of the full extent of historical landscapes, with significant areas remaining concealed. Within this broader perspective, the scale of what could be lost becomes more apparent, not as isolated fragments, but as entire systems that have been transformed and preserved in altered states beneath the water, extending beyond the limits of direct observation, while still contributing to the ongoing record of the Earth's history. There is a quiet persistence in the way certain ideas remain present, returning across generations even when evidence remains incomplete. The search for lost places, especially those believed to exist beneath the ocean, reflects a deeper inclination that extends beyond simple curiosity. It is tied to the way humans relate to their own beginnings, seeking continuity between what is known and what may have existed before recorded memory. The concept of a submerged world carries with it a particular resonance, shaped by the understanding that large portions of the Earth's surface have changed over time. As coastlines shifted and landscapes disappeared beneath rising seas, the awareness of these transformations created a space where the possibility of forgotten environments became part of how the past is imagined. This awareness does not rely on a single narrative, but emerges from the accumulation of evidence showing that entire regions once inhabited are no longer visible. Within this context, the search becomes a way of extending the boundaries of known history. Each discovery of a submerged structure or artifact contributes to a broader picture that suggests continuity between past and present. The process is not driven solely by the expectation of finding a specific place, but by the recognition that the Earth's history includes environments that have not yet been fully explored. This recognition sustains attention, guiding efforts to examine areas that remain beyond the reach of complete observation. The idea of lost worlds also carries an element that is less tangible, shaped by the way memory and imagination interact. Stories, fragments of evidence, and the visible changes in landscapes combine to form impressions of places that once existed but are no longer accessible. These impressions do not function as precise records, but as representations that capture the scale of transformation. They reflect an attempt to understand how entire environments can transition from presence to absence, leaving behind traces that must be interpreted rather than directly observed. This interplay between evidence and interpretation creates a sustained engagement with the idea of what lies beneath the surface. The ocean, by its nature, conceals more than it reveals, and this concealment contributes to the continued focus on what may be hidden within it. The limitations of exploration do not diminish this focus, but instead reinforce it, as each boundary of knowledge defines an area where further discovery remains possible. At the same time, the search is shaped by the methods and frameworks through which it is conducted. Scientific approaches provide structure, ensuring that interpretations are grounded in observable data and consistent analysis. Within this structure, curiosity operates as a guiding force, directing attention toward questions that can be examined through available methods. The balance between these elements allows the search to continue in a way that is both disciplined and open to new information. The persistence of this search reflects a broader pattern in how humans engage with the past. There is a tendency to look beyond what is immediately visible, to consider the possibility that current understanding represents only a portion of a larger history. This tendency is reinforced by discoveries that extend timelines, reveal new sites, and alter previous assumptions, each contributing to a sense that the record is incomplete. Within this ongoing process, the idea of finding what has been lost remains present, not as a fixed objective, but as a continuation of inquiry shaped by both evidence and the recognition of what remains unknown. The ocean, with its vast and largely unexplored regions, provides a setting where this inquiry can persist, supported by the understanding that beneath its surface, the traces of earlier landscapes and human activity may still exist, waiting to be identified within a framework that connects them to the broader narrative of the Earth's history. Beneath the shifting surface of the ocean lies a record that is not written in words, but in layers, each one settling quietly over the last, preserving fragments of time within a structure that grows almost imperceptibly. These layers do not announce themselves, yet together they form a continuous account of change, where materials carried by currents, rivers, and biological activity come to rest and remain. Sediment accumulates gradually, composed of particles that vary in size, origin, and composition. Fine grains drift downward from the water column, while heavier materials settle more quickly, creating subtle variations in texture and density. Over time, these deposits build into sequences that reflect the conditions present at the moment of their formation. A change in climate, a shift in current patterns, or the introduction of new materials alters the composition of what settles, leaving a distinct boundary that separates one period from another. Within these layers, traces of earlier environments are preserved in forms that remain stable under the conditions of the seafloor. Microscopic organisms, fragments of vegetation, and mineral deposits become embedded within the sediment, each contributing to a detailed record of past conditions. These inclusions do not exist in isolation, but as part of a continuous sequence where the position of each layer provides context for what it contains. The deeper the layer, the earlier the period it represents. creating a vertical timeline that extends through accumulated material. Structures and artifacts that become buried within this process are incorporated into the same record. As sediment covers them, it forms a protective barrier that reduces exposure to external forces, allowing features to remain in place. The relationship between these objects and the surrounding layers provides information about when they were deposited and the conditions that followed. Their position within the sequence becomes part of the narrative, linking human activity to the broader environmental context in which it occurred. The ocean functions as an archive through this continuous process of deposition and preservation. Unlike records that rely on deliberate documentation, this archive is formed through natural mechanisms, where each layer contributes to a cumulative account without intention. The result is a system that captures both gradual changes and more abrupt events, preserving evidence of shifts that may have occurred over extended periods or within shorter intervals. Accessing this record requires methods that can reveal its structure without disrupting its integrity. Core samples, extracted from the seafloor, provide a vertical cross-section of the layers, allowing them to be examined in sequence. Each segment of a core contains information about the materials present at a specific depth, offering insights into the conditions that existed when that layer was formed. Through analysis of these samples, patterns emerge that reflect changes in environment, climate, and biological activity. The interpretation of these layers involves connecting physical characteristics with broader processes. Variations in grain size may indicate changes in current strength, while the presence of certain organisms can reflect shifts in temperature or nutrient availability. When artifacts or structural elements are encountered within these layers, their context provides a framework for understanding their origin and the events that led to their burial. Over extended timescales, this layered record becomes increasingly complex, incorporating multiple cycles of change and stability. The accumulation of material continues, adding new layers that will eventually cover those that exist today. In this way, the ocean maintains an ongoing archive, where the present gradually becomes part of the same system that preserves the past. Within this archive, the traces of earlier landscapes and human activity are not isolated remnants, but components of a continuous record shaped by the interaction of natural processes and time. The seafloor holds these layers in place, allowing them to be read through careful study, revealing a history that extends beyond visible boundaries and remains embedded within the structure of the ocean itself. There comes a point where evidence begins to accumulate without forming a complete picture, where each discovery adds clarity to one area while leaving others unresolved. In the study of submerged landscapes, this point is reached not through a lack of data, but through the way that data remains distributed across different regions, depths, and conditions, each piece contributing to a broader understanding that is still incomplete. Across the ocean floor, findings continue to suggest that significant portions of human and environmental history lie beneath the surface. Submerged structures, altered coastlines, and preserved materials indicate that environments once capable of supporting life and activity have been transformed over time. These indications are consistent enough to establish that large-scale changes have occurred, and that traces of earlier landscapes persist within the present structure of the seafloor. At the same time, the interpretation of these findings does not converge into a single, unified explanation. Each site offers its own set of characteristics, shaped by local conditions and histories that differ from one another. While patterns can be observed, they do not align perfectly, and the variations between them introduce gaps that prevent a complete reconstruction of what once existed. The result is a body of evidence that supports the presence of submerged history, yet resists a definitive narrative. Part of this limitation arises from the nature of the environments being studied. Depth, pressure, and limited accessibility restrict the extent to which direct observation can be carried out. Even with advanced methods, there remain areas that cannot be examined in detail, leaving portions of the record beyond reach. These constraints mean that conclusions must often be drawn from partial data, where the absence of information is not evidence of absence, but a reflection of current limitations. Temporal uncertainty further contributes to this incomplete picture. Establishing precise timelines for underwater features is inherently challenging, as materials may be displaced, altered, or difficult to date accurately. Without clear chronological markers, it becomes more difficult to determine how different sites relate to one another, and whether they represent simultaneous developments or events separated by significant periods of time. Interpretation also plays a role in shaping what can be concluded. The distinction between natural and constructed formations, the identification of artifacts, and the assessment of environmental context all involve processes that depend on available evidence and the frameworks used to analyze it. As these frameworks evolve, interpretations may shift, altering how existing data is understood without necessarily resolving the underlying uncertainties. The presence of unanswered gaps does not diminish the significance of what has been found, but it defines the boundaries within which current understanding operates. These gaps are not static, and they may be reduced as new methods are developed and additional areas are explored. However, they also represent aspects of the record that may remain difficult to access or interpret, shaped by conditions that limit the preservation or visibility of certain types of evidence. Within this context, the question that cannot be fully answered is not a single inquiry, but a broader recognition of the limits of reconstruction. It reflects the understanding that while evidence points towards submerged histories, the full extent and nature of those histories may not be completely recoverable. The ocean holds a record that is both revealing and incomplete, offering insights that extend knowledge while leaving spaces where certainty does not yet reach. As exploration continues, this balance between discovery and uncertainty remains, guiding the process of investigation while acknowledging that some aspects of the past may persist beyond the boundaries of what can be fully known, existing within a record that is accessible in part, yet never entirely revealed. Beyond the edges of mapped terrain, where surveyed lines fade into open expanses, the ocean continues without clear boundary, extending into regions that remain only partially described. These areas are not empty, but unobserved in detail, holding formations, materials, and patterns that have yet to be brought into full view. Exploration has advanced steadily, revealing structures and landscapes that were once considered inaccessible. With each improvement in method, new sections of the seafloor come into focus, their features emerging from what was previously indistinct. Yet even as this progress continues, it outlines the scale of what remains beyond reach, where depth, distance, and environmental conditions limit the extent of observation. Within these unexplored regions, the potential for further discoveries is shaped by the same processes that have preserved evidence elsewhere. Sediment continues to settle, layers continue to form, and geological movement continues to alter the position of landscapes over time. These processes do not cease in areas that have not yet been studied, and as a result, the record they create extends into places that have not been directly examined. The possibility of encountering additional structures or artifacts is not based on a single expectation, but on the understanding that similar conditions have produced such findings in other locations. Where coastlines once existed, where environments supported human activity, and where subsequent changes led to submergence, there remains the potential for traces to persist. These traces may vary in form and preservation, reflecting the specific conditions of each region, yet they remain part of the broader pattern that has already been observed. Technological development continues to expand the range of what can be detected. Instruments capable of higher resolution mapping, improved navigation, and more stable operation at depth allow for more detailed examination of previously inaccessible areas. As these tools are applied, the boundary between known and unknown shifts, revealing features that were once beyond the limits of observation. This progression does not eliminate the unknown, but moves it further outward, maintaining a frontier that continues to extend. Interpretation will remain an essential part of this process, as new findings are integrated into existing frameworks. Each discovery must be assessed within its context, compared with other sites, and understood in relation to both natural processes and potential human influence. This ongoing evaluation ensures that new information contributes to a coherent understanding, even as it introduces additional complexity. The presence of unresolved elements does not indicate a lack of progress, but reflects the scale of the environment and the depth of its record. The ocean does not reveal all of its details at once, and the pace at which information becomes available is shaped by both technological capability and the conditions of the seafloor itself. This gradual unfolding allows for a continuous refinement of understanding, where each addition builds upon what has already been established. Within this evolving landscape of discovery, what remains below is not defined by a single outcome, but by the continuation of inquiry. The seafloor holds its features within a system that records, preserves, and alters over time, offering insights that emerge as exploration advances. These insights may confirm patterns already recognized, introduce new elements, or reshape interpretations in ways that extend the narrative further. The ocean remains an environment where the past persists in forms that are not immediately visible, and where the process of discovery continues to reveal connections between landscapes, materials, and histories that extend beyond current boundaries. What may still be waiting below exists within this continuity, part of a record that is gradually uncovered, yet never fully exhausted, remaining open within the steady progression of observation and understanding.